So we've been in our series here last couple of weeks, few weeks now, 4 weeks or so, we've been doing the church and discussing church, various aspects of it. And so tonight we're going to continue that. We were going to look at the church's organization and offices and ordinances, because they all go together, partly because they all start with O, and that sounds nice. But after I got delving into it and figuring out what we need to talk about, that got to be too much. So we're going to save at least some of that stuff till next week. But we'll start out with the church's organization, and then if we have time, we'll get into the church's offices, okay? So, but before we go there, let's do a little thought experiment. I want everybody, okay, do a thought experiment. Close your eyes to think if you want. Just don't fall asleep, okay? Here's the thought experiment. I want you to imagine that you're going to the door of a neighborhood church. And we'll use the word church loosely, sort of in the common way. And knock on the door there. And when someone answers, I want you to ask them the question, who's in charge here? Who makes the decisions? Okay? So think that through. You all got to, okay? Now, tell me some of the answers that you heard when you did your thought experiment here. You asked you knocked on the door of the church, and you said, who's in charge? And they said, okay, most churches would right away, they'd say God, or Jesus, or something like that. And you say, okay, but, let's go beyond that. Unless you have God audibly telling you to do things, you got some other answer as well. Who's in charge? Who's making the decisions?
The board?
The board. A board might be an answer. What else might be an answer that you'd hear? And by the way, then a nice follow-up question would be, well, who's on the board? What do you mean by a board? Okay? The pastor might be an answer. So you go someplace and they might say the pastor makes the decisions. What other kinds of answers might you get?
Membership?
The membership. Okay, membership. Anyone else? Any other answers you got? Of course, it depends on what the size and shape of the church and, what brand they are. What else did you get?
Deacon.
The deacons make the decision. Any other answers? One of them might say, well, there's a guy back in Rome that makes that decision. Okay? Or some might say, well, there's some headquarters in such and such a city or such and such a city or something like that they make the decisions. Or in most cases, the answer will be some of the decisions are made here and other decisions are made here, right? For instance, the local parish, the Pope does not make the decisions for the local parish in terms of who's going to be the priest but they might make some other decisions about doctrine or something. So sometimes the answer might be, okay? Any other answers you want to throw out? Anybody missing a favorite one? I think we got most of them. So it comes down to it, there's really about 3 kinds of church government. People break them into these 3 categories. And I think it'd be good to start today by sort of thinking about those. And then we'll delve into what the Bible says and things like that. But it's good to sort of know what's going on around us. Let's talk about the 3 different categories. And before we get going into them, we got to remember, there's different flavors and variations on these, and these 3 can sort of overlap, and some are to one extreme of the group, and things like that. So we're not trying to do one size fits all here, but 3 general categories. And the first one we call the Episcopalian form of government, sometimes known as the monarchical or hierarchical forms. How would they answer the question? Who's in charge? Who makes the decisions? Well, if it's Episcopalian, or particularly in a monarchy, who makes the decisions? If you have a political system that's a monarchy, who makes the decisions? The king, the monarch. That's why we call it a monarchy. The king makes the decision, or the royal family, or something like that. A hierarchical form would mean, there's some sort of hierarchy, a pyramid of decision-making. You all work out in the business world, right? You all got a hierarchy, you all got a boss, and the boss has a boss, and the boss's boss has a boss. And somewhere you get to the top, and there's someone at the top, and he gets to make the big decisions, right? So in a church setting, we often call that an Episcopalian method. derives from a Greek word, is episkopos, and it shows up in the Bible, and we'll see some. And in episkopos is the idea of an overseer, a boss, an overseer. Okay. So an Episcopalian form of government in a church setting would be recognized as a bishop or some other church leader. They might have different names for them, but who has power by virtue of their office. Sometimes and of course there will be usually some sort of hierarchy. For instance, there might be a bishop and then a priest and then a deacon or something like that. It can be a simple arrangement, or it can be a rather complex and steep hierarchy, right? And you all can think of those. Okay, most obvious examples would be the Roman Catholic Church, right? So the Roman Catholic Church, you start sort of at the lower level. You have laity, common people, and then you have deacons, and then priests, and then bishops, and then archbishops, and then cardinals, and then finally at the top you get to the top of the pinnacle, the Pope. If you look at the Episcopalian Church, which takes its name because it's an Episcopalian form of government, it doesn't go quite up that high, but it goes priests, it goes deacons, bishops, or priests, and then bishops, but doesn't go all the way up to having a pope or anything like that. And there's other groups. Methodist Church is one that has some Episcopalian type, and some other ones. Probably one of the things we ought to hone in on is that of that decision-making stuff, probably what we're most care about is the right to consecrate and ordain priests. That would be one of the things, right? So typically in these kinds of organizations, the right to consecrate and ordain priests and deacons belongs only to the bishops themselves. You can't just walk in and say, I'm a bishop. The church can't decide it's a bishop, there's going to make a bishop or anything like that. Who makes bishops? Other bishops, okay, or someone higher up in the hierarchy. Some of them even, but here's the thing, that the authority, the power, the authority is vested in the office of the Pope or the bishop or whoever, whatever the hierarchy is and whatever the names are, by virtue of their office. So the person at the top is at the top, and they're there by virtue of the office. Some of them believe in something called apostolic succession. They say they got that because in the early church, who was the leaders of the early church? The apostles, the 12 guys that we sometimes call them the disciples, but more commonly we'll call them the apostles, and that that privilege of ruling has passed on in an office, not in a biological sense, but in a passing of an office down to today's Pope or today's Archbishop or something like that. Okay, makes sense? So that's form number one, hierarchy. Okay, another one, a couple of you gave some answers that sort of fit in this, would we call a representative form of government, also called a federal or Presbyterian form of government. You can guess what's one of the groups that does a Presbyterian form of government? The Presbyterian Church. Yeah, see, questions aren't always so hard. There they recognize that authority is vested in some duly appointed representatives to govern the church, some sort of board or body. Okay? Presbyterian is derived from the Greek word presbyteros, which in the King James Version is always translated as an elder. So if you see elder in the New Testament, that's the word presbyteros, and that's where we get the word Presbyterian from.
Did you say the other term for that was representative?
Federal or representative form, yeah. And we sometimes call it federal or representative. You're all familiar with this from not only your religion classes, right, but from your high school civics class, right? What kind of government do we have here in the United States? Don't answer crappy or anything like that. This isn't a political forum, okay? What kind of, it's a representative form of government, right? We have some power invested in states, some power vested in, at the federal level, but more than that, we don't vote on every single law, do we? Okay? Instead, what do? We elect a representative, and then that representative goes and, at least in theory, represents us in making laws and doing things and stuff like that. How well your representative does that, well, that's between you and your ballot box, okay? You got to decide that. But we understand the representative form of government, and that's the kind of government that many church-type organizations use. Again, we mentioned the Presbyterian Reformed churches use that type. So typically, it varies a little bit from organization to organization, but typically what happens is that every local church elects ruling elders to represent them, and that's actually the term they use. And this group forms what they call a church session, and that church authority lies within that body. That body has the power to tell the church what to do, things like that. So the church elects the body, but then the body choose it, then those elected guys can choose what to do what they want, just like you can elect your government representative and then he goes off to Washington and does whatever he wants. A distinction is usually made in that church session between those that govern and don't teach or preach or administer the ordinances or things like that. They'll call the ones that govern the ruling elders, and those that teach or preach, what we would generally recognize as pastors, that kind of role, as being the teaching elders is a typical way. And in most groups, they sort of make that distinction between teaching elders, they're the guys that go to seminary and things like that and learn and come back and preach and teach and all that kind of stuff, and then the ruling elders who are a different group. Typically, at the local church, you have a group, and then they typically have, a higher group, which is sort of a regional or district, and they have a presbytery there that's made up of all the ordained ministers or teaching elders and one ruling elder from each church for each local congregation in the district. And typically in these, like in the Presbyterian Church, each local congregation can elect its own pastor, its own ruling elder, or teaching elder, if you will, but it has to be approved by the next level up. So you don't just get to choose your own, you have to go get permission or draw from the names given to you by the district presbytery. Okay, and usually then there's always another layer. The synod is a typical name for it, and that's a synod might be, over a big region. And then even synods are often have a general assembly, which is like all the churches of that flavor have a general assembly. And in each of these, as you go each level up, there's some representatives that are elected from the previous one and things like that. So, and that brings us to the third form. And again, there's lots of variations in this, so I'm just trying to broad stroke it. But there's one other form of church government, which would be congregational. In the congregational form, who gets to make the decisions? Who has the authority to do stuff? The church members do, the congregation do. And we see that in Baptist churches. We also see it in some other churches, like the congregational churches. Again, we're not always real creative when we name these groups, right? They were called Congregationalists because they had this congregational form of government. Disciples of Christ is another one. They have this kind of government. And particularly for the Baptists, we generally would say it this way: so no outside man or group has can exercise authority over that local congregation. Okay, that local congregation is totally in charge of itself. The government of that group is totally in the hands of the people themselves. Now, there are some variations of that. Even among, say, Baptists, we have some Baptists, like this church, in which we say we're totally independent. No one else can tell us what to do. We do associate with other churches. We have relationships with other churches, and we band together to work together and stuff like that. But no other church has the authority to tell us what to do, and we don't have the authority to tell any other church what to do. And some are a little bit not as strict about that for even some Baptists. For instance, in Southern Baptists have a Southern Baptist convention, and the convention is a little bit stricter, a little bit tighter thing, and the Southern Baptist Convention does tell the Southern Baptist churches some things to do, but still in the general flavor of, each individual organization gets to choose one. And then there's some that's even further like that. In the Baptist circles, if you go to like the American Baptist, the ABC USA, and groups like that, they're even, there are formal headquarters elsewhere. We have no headquarters anywhere. And for this church, the only headquarters we have is, whoever's up front talking at the moment in a business meeting. Okay, so we select in a congregational form, you select your own pastors, you get to determine the criteria, things like that. You run your own programs, you get to decide. Now, obviously you share information about, what works and doesn't work, and, we purchase VBS material and Sunday school material and things like that, but it's our decision about what we do, that kind of stuff, and that's true in these congregationals. Here's an example, how they vary. The United Church of Christ, which is generally congregational in nature, but does have a hierarchical general synod, whose, to use a quote they give, this general synod, whose guidance is held in highest regard. So the general synod can tell you what to do, and you're supposed to take that advice with the highest regard, but you're not required to. And each congregation can hire and fire their ministers and staff as it wishes, but the association, in this case the synod, retains the authority to actually ordain, to tell people. So there's 3 different forms of government. Again, there's some variations within those. What's the Bible say? And by the way, no, let's go with that. What does the Bible say? Well, first thing we want to do is go back to a lesson we had a couple of weeks ago. Where's the word church come from? You remember? Ecclesia. So, see, and you weren't even here. You guys all know that, right? Because you were here. The word that's translated church in the New Testament is the word ecclesia, which means a called out assembly. And we talked about some of the background of that. So by its very nature of the word, it's talking about, and we looked at how the Greeks used the word, in their city-states, how they govern their city-states and things like that, has the very nature of being a local assembly. People called out to do the business of that city-state, or in our case, to do the business of this church, what it's told to do, and we talked about the Great Commission and all that kind of stuff. So that by the very nature of the word in the Scriptures, every church is a local, independent body of believers, covenanted together to carry out the Great Commission. And that means it's governed congregationally. And we see that in the Scriptures a lot. And this one, a bunch of them we're going to come look at in a minute. This one, I'll just tell you the story. If you go to Acts chapter 1, let's keep in mind what's happening in Acts chapter 1.
Jesus returned to heaven?
It was right after Jesus had returned to heaven. And the disciples are sitting around looking at each other with a blank look in their face, like, what do we do now? And by the way, they look around and say, there's only 10 other people besides me, and we need 12, so we need another disciple. And so what do? They drew lots. They voted, actually. We sometimes when we use the words draw lots, we think of a random thing. This wasn't implying they did it randomly. The phrase drew lots there says that they voted. As a matter of fact, they got together 2 candidates. They looked around, so it was, a bunch of them, and they looked around and said, hey, you and you. Matthias was one of them. I forget the name of the other guy. And said, you guys look like good candidates. What do you all think? And they all think, those are good candidates, but now we got to choose. How are we going to choose? Well, they drew lots. They voted. So we have already an election in that setting. This is long before even the day of Pentecost or anything like that. Jesus had just ascended. So We're going to continue that idea and look at this idea of the congregational nature of the churches in the New Testament. And it's important to realize that throughout the New Testament, the scriptures repeatedly talk about the responsibilities of the churches, meaning every member of the church, talking about the churches as a membership. Now, sometimes it's talking about specific things. You know, there's certain things about the pastor, certain things about the deacon, certain things. But most of the things where it's assigning responsibility to the church it's giving it to the church as a bunch of people and saying, you people, you congregation, are to go do these things in certain authorities, and we'll look at that. 1 Corinthians 1:10 describes them as being perfectly joined, a congregation as being perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. Okay. So, let's talk about some of the things that the churches have to do. We already talked a couple of weeks ago about the mission of the church. The mission of the church is to do what?
Preach the gospel.
Preach the gospel.
Make disciples.
And make disciples. And what's in the middle there?
Baptize.
Baptize them, teach them, make disciples. We call that the Great Commission. We studied a whole lesson on some of that. But just as a review and to look at it through the lens of what we're talking about in terms of government, let's read it. This is Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. So this is a good place to, if you have a Bible and you want to look at it, you can follow along. It said, again, Matthew 28, 18 to 20. It says, and Jesus came and spake unto them. Who's them in that case? The disciples. As a matter of fact, all the believers. There's nothing there that really says it was just the 12, although it was certainly the 12 or the 11. Judas had gone off and done his thing then. But it certainly seems to be saying all of them. It says, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. So, who has the power, the authority? Jesus does. And what does Jesus do with that authority? He gives it to the church. He gives it to them. That group that called out assembly of believers in there. That, we joke, only semi-jokingly call it First Baptist Church of Jerusalem there. Okay? And he's giving that authority to the group. Did he give it to just one man? No. Did he give it to a board? No. He gave it to the church there. And he says, and what authority did he give them? What responsibility did he give them? He says, go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Amen. And we dissected that verse several weeks ago, but we want to see where the responsibility and the authority for making disciples, who is that given to? The church. So, I'll ask the question. Today, who has the responsibility and the authority to make disciples?
The church.
We do. The church does, okay? The church does. Now, churches are composed of people, so it has to be the people in the church. You know, there's no mystical church except for the people in the church. But it is important to sort of realize that's not just the pastor's responsibility. It's not just the deacon's responsibility. It's not just the soul winners that come out on some soul winning night or something like that. It's everyone's responsibility. Now, we all go about it somewhat differently because we all have different personalities and connections and things like that. But everyone's responsibility is to give a testimony of what happened to them that honors Christ and draws people in. Allows the Holy Spirit to convict them and draw them in. Okay, you don't have to memorize a bunch of tricky verses or anything like that, although there are some things you can memorize to help you. But the real idea is we're all to be soul winners because we are to give testimony about what happened to us. And if you're in the church, the presumption is Something has happened to you, okay? Something happened to you at the time of your conversion, and some things have happened to you since then as well, right? And so the telling about those things, while we get a little bit nervous and scared about it because we don't want people to think we're too strange or something, that's what we're called to do. That's the authority that is given to us and not given to anyone else. There's a lot of outside parachurch groups and other groups that will often do these kinds of things, but I would point out the authority for and I can't say they're doing it right or wrong or anything like that, except to say the scriptures point out that the authority to do it is given to churches. And if someone's doing it and they're under the authority of the church, cool. If they're not under the authority of the church, well, that doesn't seem to be what the scriptures are saying here. What else? What other authority was given to churches? Well, let's look at 1 Corinthians 11:2. 1 Corinthians 11:2. There are other verses in the Bible that talk about this as well, but this is probably a good one that really points it out. 1 Corinthians 11:2. Now, we ought to back up and remind ourselves, what's the book of 1 Corinthians all about? Who wrote it? Paul did. And who's he writing to? The church of Corinth. Once again, we're not real tricky with our name, okay? We call it Corinthians because it was written to the church at Corinth, to the Corinthians there. But why did Paul write the book of Corinthians?
Encouragement, instruction.
Why did they need encouragement and instruction? Because, first of all, they asked for some help. Why did they ask for some help? Because they were a mess, okay? They were, for lack of a better term, they were a mess, right? And it starts out the letter by pointing out, well, you guys are arguing among yourselves. I'm of this guy, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Paul, I'm of this, and they're just full of divisions, and it goes all through it, and there's immorality and all sorts of things that they're doing wrong. And occasionally he says, you're doing things right. And by the way, they did straighten out a whole bunch of things based on that letter, and when he writes the second letter to them, he says, hey, paraphrasing what the whole book says, hey, you're doing a whole lot better, guys, good job, okay? But, so he gets, one of the things that he really is getting on to them about is their observance of the ordinances. We'll talk about the ordinances next week, but he's really talking about, and in this particular passage, he's mostly referring to how they were doing the Lord's Supper, and they were doing it all wrong, and all sorts of trouble, and this gets him to hear 1 Corinthians 11:2, which says, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I have delivered them to you. Now, he phrases that sort of tricky. He's sort of reminding them to keep them as he gives them to them. But the thing we want to dwell on tonight is, how did they get the ordinances? From Jesus. But Jesus directly? Did Jesus ever show up at the church at Corinth? No. Who did? Paul did. How did Paul? So they got him from Jesus, but through Paul, right? And he's basically saying, hey guys, the authority to do the ordinances was given to you. And that's the point I want to sort of make right here. The ordinances are not Christian ordinances. They are church ordinances. They're to be observed within the context of the church. And that's what he's telling the Corinthians. And by the way, pointing out to them, and don't change them either, okay? Do them the way I told you to do them. Because that's the way Jesus told me, the Holy Spirit told me to tell you. Go do it that way, the way I told you. But for us, the important thing is that they were to conduct the ordinances. They had been given the authority to do the ordinances within the church setting. They are church ordinances. So, church had authority to make disciples, conduct ordinances. Next one. Let's go to Acts chapter 6. Acts chapter 6. We already sort of looked at one of these with Acts chapter 1, but there's another one in Acts chapter 6 I'd like to bring up. We'll talk about this one a little bit more later on, but this is Acts chapter 6, and we'll do verses 2 and 3, and then 5. It says, Then the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto them, and said, It is not reason that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Wherefore, brethren, look ye out among you 7 men of honest report, full of the Holy Ghost and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. And then down to the verse 5, and the saying pleased the whole multitude, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Ghost, and Philip, and Prochorus, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte of Antioch. What's going on here? I'll give you a hint. This is the first calling of the deacons. And when we talk about deacons in a few minutes, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But they had a need for some church leaders, right? And so what did they do when they needed some church leaders?
Voted.
They voted, okay? It says that they called the multitude of the disciples on them. So the 12, the ones that were leading the church there, this is in Jerusalem, the ones that were leading the church there at Jerusalem, and they called all the disciples there, called the entire church there, and they said, hey, we have a need. And the need was, he told it back in verse 1, the church had gotten so big because they were saving people every day and baptizing people every day, and they were growing and growing and growing, and some folks said, this is an administrative headache. And the particular issue that really raised it was that people were worried because their widows weren't going to getting looked after someone else's widows, which, when you got a big church, those kinds of things happen. They weren't doing administrative stuff well, and the 12 said, hey, this place is huge. How can we keep track of anyone? Well, here's the answer. We'll elect some more leaders to help us with the administration, and we'll look at their role a little bit more later, but the point I want to focus on now is that they were elected. Churches elect their own leaders. Give you another example, Acts 15. This one's a little bit different, so I'll bring out some more points. Acts chapter 15. We won't read the entire chapter. It's a long chapter. Very important chapter, though, because some things are going on. In order to really get what was going on, you have to read through chapter 14 as well. We're not going to read all that today. So, but if you've been studying the scriptures, you're acquainted with the episode. Paul and Barnabas and some others have been out on their missionary journey, sent out by the church at Antioch. And so they've been out wandering around, preaching the word, starting churches, things like that. And they were sent out of the church at Antioch, and they had just returned from that missionary journey to the church of Antioch to give a report to them. And they heard about some problems that were going on. The biggest problem that was going on was that there were a bunch of people running around that said, hey guys, you still have to be circumcised though. And Paul and Barnabas said, well, wait a minute, that's not right. And everyone else was saying, I don't think that sounds right. What do you think, Paul and Barnabas? And they said, doesn't sound right to us. As a matter of fact, we've been out preaching exactly the opposite. Paul and Barnabas had run into these guys on their missionary journey. Matter of fact, they were following them around, trying to undermine what Paul and Barnabas were doing. It tells us that in Acts chapter 14. And then we get to 15, 2 and 3. So they make a decision. They're going to go down to Jerusalem from Antioch, and they're going to get people from a bunch of other churches together to discuss this. And in chapter 15, verse 2 and 3, it says, when therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they, the church of Antioch, determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. And being brought on their way by the church, they passed through Phoenice and Samaria, declaring the conversion of the Gentiles, and they caused great joy unto all the brethren. And the last part, takes us in a different direction, so we don't want to pursue that. But then you go through the rest of the chapter and you read what happened at that council. What I wanted to bring out now is that Paul and Barnabas were members of that church at Antioch, And what's it say happened? That the church at Antioch determined. It's the same word, it's the word chose. They chose as their representatives Paul and Barnabas. They had a vote. They said, we pick you guys. And to represent them. And then it says they brought them. The sense of that word is that they sent them. They paid for their trip. They gave them instructions and things like that. So they were Antioch's representatives at this other meeting. Again, the authority is in the local church, and that's how this church at Antioch, and some of the other churches, but that's how that church at Antioch responded, was by choosing some members to represent them at this council meeting. Got it? One more example. 2 Corinthians 8:19. Okay, so this is the second letter to the Corinthians. We just talked about the first letter. Paul's writing back to the Corinthians, and he still has some things to discuss with them. But the tone is much different than in the first letter. He's basically saying, yeah, you guys are getting some of this stuff straightened out and stuff. And Paul is, in chapter 8, he's thanking the Corinthian church for its generosity in helping with offering offerings for others. Okay, he's taking up some offerings for the people back in Jerusalem that were in the middle of a famine and going through some hard times. And the church at Corinth had given liberally. Corinth was a very wealthy area, and presumably the church was fairly wealthy, relatively speaking, as well. And so Paul thanked them for their generous gift, and then he says, and that not only, but who also was talking about Titus, who also was chosen of the churches to travel with us in this grace, who is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord and declaration of your ready mind. So they'd elected Titus. Okay? So the local churches chose their own leaders. Again, congregationally, a vote of the people, a vote of the members. One last area, Matthew 18:17 is a good place to start, and then we'll go to 2 Thessalonians. So Matthew 18:17. Give you a second there to thumb if you wish. It says, and if he shall neglect to hear them, so this is about a dispute between two brothers, okay? And Paul's giving a bunch of, or Jesus is giving a bunch of instructions. Jesus here in Matthew is giving a bunch of instructions on how to get along with each other and how to resolve difficulties they have as he's forming this first church of Jerusalem. He's already called them and got them together and has been teaching them, and this is part of his teaching to them. And he says, so if you had this dispute, and if he shall neglect to hear them, so first there he says resolve it personally. And then he says if you can't resolve it personally, then go to him with 2 or 3 people so that there's witnesses and you can, the counsel of many and that kind of stuff. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. So that's the idea of church discipline. And in this case, if someone is causing trouble in the church and is in willful disobedience, and you take these steps to try and work it out, and you can't work it out, what's the next step? To put them outside the church. And who is that authority? The church does. And it says there, that's instructions to the church, and this is what you are to do. Okay? And there's several other verses along those lines, but we want to keep on. So 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 14, 15. And if any man obey not our word by this epistle, note that man, and have no company with him, that he may be ashamed, yet count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. Okay, so there's the point. If he really is a brother, you should treat him as a brother, but in this case, if he's not doing what the scriptures say, he needs to be admonished as a brother, even to the point of not counted as an enemy, but admonished, put out. Okay? 1 Corinthians chapter, we won't read it all, but 1 Corinthians chapter 5, again, Paul's writing to the church of Corinth that had lots of problems. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 is all about how to resolve those problems, including the idea of church discipline. The church has the authority and the responsibility to put people outside the church, to remove their membership if warranted at a certain point. So those are some of the things that congregationally, that should work in a congregational manner by the will of the membership, by the will of the congregation, because that's where Christ invested the responsibility, the authority. Okay? Well, how do we get all those other things then? We started by, you went and knocked on a bunch of doors, at least in your mind, you knocked on a bunch of doors, right? Got a whole bunch of other answers. Where'd those answers come from? Well, I guess I could be flippant saying, well, if they didn't come from the Scriptures, it must have come from outside the Scriptures, right? But let's take a little bit more of that. How about a historical view, okay? And sort of look through how history treated this idea of church government. So in the first century, and don't worry, we're not going to do 2,000 years of history here. We could, but we'd be here until next week, and you won't last that long. My voice won't last that long. We have entire courses at the Bible Institute on this. But we'll give you just the 5-minute snapshot here. So in the first century, for the most part, churches were all congregational in nature, and they did just the way that we talked about. Now, again, some of them had problems. We just looked at how the Church of Corinth was having some problems and things like that. But for the most part, they were clearly congregational in nature. And we see this not only from the Scriptures themselves, but we also have outside historical references, Josephus and others, that really seem to infer, and the writings of church fathers and things like that, that seem to talk about the congregational nature of these churches. There was no mega church. There was no one in charge of a bunch of churches. There was no, no one, for the most part, dominated a church. Now, clearly we had people that had high stature, if you will, but they didn't have any more authority than anyone else. When they all raised their hands to vote in the matters that we just saw either, Paul might raise his hand, and Barnabas might raise his hand, but that guy that just got saved would also raise his hand, and his vote would count just as much as Paul's did. Now, we don't explicitly say that in the Scriptures, but it certainly seems to be indicating that, because the churches acted congregational in nature, same way that the Greek city-states and ecclesias were totally congregational, if you will, in nature. But by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, we start to see a shift. Well, that goes away. Things place. One of the things that started to come up was something we call sacerdotalism. That's a $10,000 theology word, sacerdotalism. Anyone know what sacerdotalism means? You get bonus points if you do. Don't feel ashamed if you don't. I had to look it up. Sacerdotalism literally means relating to priests and a priestly hierarchy. What that means in practice is that by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we started to see a shift in churches into a laity and a clergy that had authority that the laity did not have. A difference. They were viewed as the super special guys. Now, some of that may have been just sort of a legitimate. After all, this is a time in which they to alternating degrees, under severe persecution from the Roman Empire. At times, they were being tortured and even put to death by Rome. Other times, maybe not quite so much. They lived in some relative peace, but it was not an easy time. And you can imagine that the leaders of the churches, the ones that had been given positions, had tougher times than others, and it's easy to view them as the heroes of the faith and things like that. And but what began to emerge that would be wrong is to say that you were giving authority to them that the New Testament doesn't, that the scriptures don't give them. They were assuming authority and responsibility. And it's, I think one thing that influenced them a lot was the Old Testament model. Because what did we have in the Old Testament? We talked about that many, many weeks ago. But in the Old Testament, you all know about the temple, right? And the Levites and all that. How did the Levite system work? I'll sip my water until someone gives me an answer. How's that? How did the Levitical priesthood system work? One sentence version, not the 15-minute version we talked about earlier.
I guess it's the Levites.
Yeah.
They are the ones who are in charge of the temple.
The Levites were in charge. They were in charge of the temple. They had their position because of their birth, their lineage, and they took that very seriously. They were the super Christian. We really see that in the New Testament, right? With the Sadducees and the Pharisees in particular. The Pharisees were the guys that ran around saying, they wouldn't use these words, but I'm the super Christian. I'm more righteous than you. I'm holier than you because I'm a Levite. And I keep all the fast days and I do all the, all that kind of stuff. And in the Old Testament, they did have a hierarchy. And we even talked about this some, the Aaronic priesthood, and then the regular Levites, and then the rest and everyone else, and they all had different jobs and things like that. And there was all the trappings of power and prestige, and at the top was the high priest, which was the guy that went in and offered the sacrifices and things like that. And you can start to see the New Testament churches borrowing that model within the churches and starting to think, well, we got to have some really holy guy at the top and trickle down. And we start to see that happen. And even, for instance, Ignatius talks about, he's an early church figure that died in 117 AD. And he talks some about that. And the Clement of Rome, who died in 110. In their writings, we see that starting to happen in the churches where they start making, I think Clement was the first one that really started referring to the clergy as opposed to the laity. And by the 3rd century or so, then that was really starting to become institutionalized in a lot of churches. They started making distinctions between the bishops and the elders. They created other offices, the deacon, in addition to the deacons, they had the subdeacons and the electors, and they had guys called acolytes and things like that. And you're building an entire hierarchy in a lot of the churches. Irenaeus, another church historian in the later part of the 2nd century, he tried to advance the idea of the episcopacy and apostolic succession. We talked about, that model. Irenaeus was a big proponent of that, and that was in the second half of the 2nd century. Cyprian, in the early part of the 3rd century, really came along and emphasized the priesthood of sacrificial works. Your salvation comes not just through the saving grace of Christ, but through the priest or the head of the church. He had some priestly duties in terms of that. Starting the idea of the universal church, outside of which there's no salvation. You can only be saved inside the church and through, through the leaders of that church and the things they said. Another thing that started to happen was something that we call metropolitan churches. We call it that, that idea because they were usually in metropolitan areas, larger areas. But the idea of bigger churches bossing around smaller churches, being the smaller churches were subordinate to the bigger churches. And that sort of made sense, particularly as they were living in the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was divided into different, provinces and then sub-provinces and things like that. And so they sort of started, the head church in a province would be the main church, and all the other ones would be subordinate, and they would look to that church. We start to see a hierarchy of church. We have hierarchies developing within the churches and hierarchies developing of the churches as well. The church at Rome was one that took prominence. After all, it was the seat of the Roman Empire, and it was also where, Paul spent a lot of his time in jail, but Paul spent a lot of his time and things like that. So the head of the Church of Rome started to take on special prominence, and the whole Roman Church started to take authority over some of the other churches. And then we get to the first half of the 4th century when Constantine came along. Constantine had a conversion, we'll use that in quotes, a conversion to Christianity, but he basically flipped the switch and made the entire Roman Empire convert to Christianity. And so now, as being a Christian rather than being persecuted, it was first allowed, and then it became the super cool thing to do. And it was eventually mandated throughout the empire, and that grew into the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. Now, it is important also to remember, not every church went along with this. Okay, that's sort of the general outline. But there were plenty of them. Some of the groups, well, just in the interest of time, I won't name them all, but like the Monatists, which were a movement started in Asia Minor around 150 AD, and then spread across Europe and Africa. The Novatians in about 250 AD. The Donatists, which started primarily in North Africa, then spread through the Middle East about 350 AD. They did not go along with the Metropolitan Church idea of the hierarchy. We would look at those churches and see their informed church government, much like what we would practice today. And of course, we'll skip 1,000 years of history and go up to the Reformation. In the Reformation, you have a lot of folks that rebel against the idea of a single Roman or even Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches and the power of the Pope and all of that, but still retain some of those ideas in terms of church government and things like that. So you still have hierarchical or Presbyterian type, representative types. So there's forms of church government. That's the organization of the church, and we see that from the scriptures, the organization ought to be totally congregational. How about the offices of the church? What offices do we have in the church? We have still 15 minutes to talk about this. We can get through this.
Pastors and deacons.
Pastors and deacons. Oh, and a whole bunch of others too, right? Well, if you look at our list of offices, we have a whole lot of names on the offices. What do you think? Well, look at Philippians chapter 1, verse 1. Now, this is just an introductory verse. Keep that in mind. Philippians chapter 1. Who's writing in Philippians chapter 1? Who's writing the epistle to the Philippians? Paul, okay? How do we know Paul's writing it? Because he says so, yeah. Like, once again, this stuff isn't always that hard, okay? Paul says. Matter of fact, Paul had help, right? Timothy. Paul and Timotheus, the servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus which are at Philippi. So who are they writing to?
Church.
The church at Philippi. And when he says he's writing to all the saints, that he's referring to the church there, okay? Oh, and then he does mention with the bishops and deacons. Okay, so there we have the two, I'll use this word to start with, biblical positions in the church. Now, I don't want that to sound like other positions are not biblical, although it sounds like that. We'll get to them a little bit. But the scriptures call out two positions in the church. First one has several names, but it's really one position, one thing, and that's the pastor, or the bishop, or the overseer, or the elder, and those are all really the same role as you start to compare the ways that it's talked about in the scriptures. They use some different words for it, and most people sort of feel that when they use the word elder, that's really speaking more about the qualifications of the man, and the term bishop or overseer is really talking more about the role of the office. But it's really the same thing. It's the same idea. It's just one's referring to what they do and one's referring to sort of who they are, if you will. So turn to 1 Timothy. That's the last really big thing that we're going to read. We're going to read a few other things, but 1 Timothy is the really big thing we're going to see. And the second one's going to be deacon. So when we get to 1 Timothy, it's going to talk about both pastors and deacons. 1 Timothy chapter 3, 1 to 7. Now, keep in mind, who's writing this? Paul. And who's writing it to? Timothy. Okay? And really, it's more of a personal letter to Timothy. And when you read it, it comes across more of a personal letter to Timothy. But it has plenty of application in churches, of course. 1 Timothy chapter 3, and I'll just read 1 to 7. It says, "This is a true saying. If a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest he be lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good report of them that are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." Over and don't look at it now, go take this as homework. But Titus chapter 1, verses 5 to 9 has a very similar list of requirements that Paul has given, or that a list of requirements there. Okay? One I really want to, and I'm not going to dwell so much on what the requirements are, because that's a whole nother discussion. You know, this idea of husband and one wife, vigilant, sober, what do each of those mean, and things like that. There's a whole nother study. What I really want to focus on is generally is the office here. But I do want to point out, look at verse 5 again. It says, "For if a man know not how to rule his own house," verse 4, "if one ruleth well his own house, for if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God?" That verse is often misunderstood. And let's focus on the word rule there. Is the pastor the ruler of the church? Well, depends on how you define ruler. Okay? And I'll give you another verse in just a minute to go along with this in Peter, 1 Peter. But it's useful to look at that word rule over there. Does not have the connotation of authority. Instead, it's the Greek word prostemi, which means literally to stand before, to be a guardian or protector, to give aid and care for. So what's it say that he's supposed to do in this context? One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection of all gravity. He's to care for his family. Okay? It's not talking about being the boss of the family. It's not talking about ruling over in the sense of cracking the whip. It says he's the one that's to stand to guard his family, to be the protector of his family, to be the one that is caring for his family. In subjection. The word subjection in verse 4 has the idea of humbleness, self-control. Going along with this is 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. I got time, we'll read it. It says, "The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the suffering of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. And when the great chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away." So he's talking, who's he talking to? The elders, the pastors, the leaders there that have been elected by that church to And what's it say that they're supposed to do? Take the oversight. That's that Greek word that we ran into earlier, episkopos. Okay? But verse 3 is a critical one. Neither as being lords, exercising power or authority. So, the pastor is not the boss of the church. The church is the boss of the church. The pastor has a special role in guarding and protecting the church. And it's a terribly challenging role because you got challenges from the outside, you got challenges from the inside. But it also is pointing out how you have to be careful about how you go about doing that, right? Because you're not ruling in the sense that we normally use the word rule. It says, furthermore, you're not. Neither as being lords over God's heritage. They act as the church has given them authority to act. But that authority is not inherent in their position. It's authority given to them by the church. Okay, we got just a few more minutes, and we don't want to beat on pastors too much. We got another group of people to beat on. The deacons. Okay, and so the word deacon is actually the Greek word diakonio, which means to minister or to serve, like a hired servant or a slave. Although it doesn't refer to a servant or slave relationship, it's activities to serve. So it's the idea of to minister. And I found this interesting. They say that the root means to stir up the dust. So if you don't know what a deacon does, he stirs up the dust. Okay, he sweeps. Well, it's the idea of always being busy. You stir up the dust. It comes from a phrase that means they're so busy running around doing things that their feet, are continually turning dust. I come from, farmland, and we have all these old gravel roads. And as you drive down the gravel road, what happens? You get billows of smoke from behind you, of dust that gets kicked up. That's what deacons are to be doing, is to kicking up the dust because they're so busy. We all read in Acts 6, 1-6, we won't go back and review that, but that's where we first see them, and they were appointed to help the administration of this busy church. And the particular issue was, making sure that the relief and aid was being distributed the way that it should. People were being taken care of. Everybody's being ministered to properly. When you got a church with thousands and thousands of people, that's a chore, and so they had these guys to do it. That passage we'll go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3 that talks about the qualifications of the pastor, follows on with the qualifications of the deacon. It says, likewise must the deacons be grave, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy of filthy lucre, holding the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience, and let these also first be proved. Proved means to be tested. Then let them use the office of a deacon, being found blameless. Even so must their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. Let the deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children and their own house as well. Again, the idea of ruling there is guarding or protecting. It's not the idea of being the master. For they that have used the office of a deacon well purchase to themselves a good degree and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus. So we have some similar qualifications to the pastor for the deacons. And many churches have deacons. We have one at the moment. We've talked about more. And they do a great job not letting the dust, kicking up the dust to help minister and care for that. So we got just one thing to talk about and things to talk about, maybe two things to talk about. How do we get pastors and deacons? Well, we already talked about we elect them, and both of those are elected, but there's an actual process, and you saw it embedded in what we read there. We call that process ordination. We'll talk about the ordinances next week. Ordinances are a very related idea. Ordination is the process by which we do that thing that I just said, where we prove them. We test them first. So Ordination, to be ordained literally means to be set in place. And there's two: set in place, meaning in God's the way that God has set an order up in the church. These are the two positions. And the process is we watch and observe for a time. That's the proving there, the testing. And then they appear before a presbytery, and it mentions that in the words that we did. Presbytery is just a bunch of senior guys who've already been through all this, who get to, who gather them together. We get them together and we say, okay, have at them. When I was working on my PhD, we had a very similar arrangement. You work under a thesis advisor and stuff. But no, you got to have a thesis committee, a dissertation committee, right? What's the dissertation committee get to do? Well, you write your dissertation, and then they get to throw darts at you for several hours and make you feel, you study forever, you make you feel absolutely miserable, and then, and they're all sour-faced, and then at the end, then, they send you out, and then 5 minutes later they bring you back in and say, yeah, you're all good. We knew you were going to be good going in, but we had to make you feel miserable. That's the way it actually sort of works that way. Huh? Yeah, it's the ritual you have to go through. Yeah, and in some sense it really is more than a ritual. But if they know you, they already know going into it whether you're qualified. We're actually going through that now with our church at Benchmark, our mission at Benchmark. We have a need for a deacon down there, and there's certainly plenty of need, and we have a man we think is qualified. He's still in that, they're going to grill me so much, I know they're going to make me feel miserable, and we're so we're sort of coaching him through and saying, well, these are the questions we asked, and you know it all, don't worry about it. Same way my advisor had to tell me, don't worry about it, and I fully expect he'll do well enough on his testing that, at the end we'll give him a sour face, and then we'll say, oh, yeah, we know you. And we did this with Brother Michael Kim not too long ago. I guess it's been 10 years or so, when we ordained him into the ministry and then sending him out as a missionary. And I still remember, just looking at the pictures not too long ago, we gathered everyone. We had the presbytery, and they gave him some questions, and he did just fine. And then we took a church vote, because that's what's required. We took a church vote, and the church said, yes, let's ordain him. And then we all laid hands on him and said, good job, you made it, and shook his hand and kissed him, and then put him on an airplane to Korea, and haven't seen him since. So now, one last thing we ought to talk about. There are other positions in the church as well. We don't want to say that those are the two ordained positions, but there are other positions as well. We have, things like treasurers and teachers, trustees, ministry directors is how we've organized here. And that's the right thing to do. Churches take organization. It's an organization. If the church is going to be an organism, you got to have some organization. You got to have, some idea of who's got to talk to who, and who has to coordinate with who, and who has responsibility for what. But the key point is, all of that is at the authority of the church. So our treasurer just walked in, one of our treasurers, and they act at the authority of the church. I, as a trustee, act at the authority of the church. There's certain legal ramifications, and and the church could, and we do that, things like, and we have some things to help smooth that out. For instance, our ministry directors are allowed some discretionary spending. We don't want to have to come back to the church every time you want to buy a paperclip, So we say, okay, this much you can buy for this kind of purpose without any sort of approval and things like that. We don't see that as usurping the authority of the church. That's the church granting its authority to help things operate smoothly. And that's obviously important. We have a famous business meeting once where we argued for an hour and a half about buying $50 air freshener for the restroom. And we said, well, now, why are we spending an hour and a half to discuss? I'll delegate to that something. Church has more important things to do. But nonetheless, the authority really is invested in the church. We have a missions team that takes care of the nuts and bolts of the, and by the way, if you ever want to serve, or even if you don't want to serve on it, you just want to follow it, it's a great thing to do. That tracks all of our missionaries and reads the missions letters and knows where the needs are and brings reports to the church and things like that to help facilitate. But they act at on behalf of the entire church in doing all that, only with the authority that the the rest of the church, that the church itself did. And the church has granted them by vote certain authority. And if they want to do something that wasn't within that authority that they've already been granted, they have to come back to the church because that's where the authority is. Ultimately, the church decides everything. The authority is given to the church, and only as the church itself delegates it to people within the church can it be given up. Does that make sense? So we covered church's organization, and we covered the offices. We'll cover the ordinances next week, baptism and the Lord's Supper. Okay, sound good? Those are the big 3 O's that I had, and I got about as far as I thought it would. So, okay, we have about 5 minutes or so until the kids come up. We'll dismiss, and if you want to stay around and see the awards, you're welcome to. If you want to stay around and retrieve kids, you're allowed to. The only rule is you can only retrieve as many as you brought, okay? You can't retrieve more, and you can't retrieve fewer either. So, okay? Okay, thank you.